Good evening. I'm Ian Wardropper, Director of the Frick Collection. I'm delighted to welcome you all to a lecture this evening by Arthur K. Wheelock, Jr., titled The Making of an Icon, How the Girl with a Pearl Earring Gained Its Fame. As we've watched the record number of people streaming in the doors of the Frick to see the current exhibition, we've had time to reflect on the magnetic draw of one painting. There are, in fact, 15 masterworks from the Mauritshuis on display, and together they make a compact yet satisfying account of the genius of Dutch 17th century art. But undeniably, one painting resonates in the public imagination. The title of this exhibition, when it was shown in San Francisco and Atlanta, was The Girl with the Pearl Earring, Dutch Paintings from the Mauritshuis. We chose to title this here, Vermeer, Rembrandt, and Hale's Masterpieces of Dutch Painting from the Mauritshuis, to emphasize that the show is not just about one painting, but represents some of the best artists from the Dutch Golden Age. Nonetheless, the popularity of the show when it was in Tokyo, where it had the highest attendance of any exhibition in the world last year, prompted us to acknowledge the star power of one painting. We decided to give it its own gallery and asked the Mauritshuis to lend us a few more works to fill out an adjacent gallery, which they generously did. I can think of no better person to assess the phenomenon surrounding the painting than Arthur Wheelock, curator of Northern Baroque painting at the National Gallery in Washington. Of his many publications, just to name those centered on this artist, are Jan Vermeer, 1981, Vermeer and the Art of Painting, 1995, not to mention Perspective Optics and Delft Artists around 1650, which he published in 1977, which naturally concerned the artist too. Of his exhibitions, Johannes Vermeer in 1995, we all remember, and The Public and Private in the Age of Vermeer of 2000. But he has written about and organized shows on many other Dutch artists, including Gerrit Douw, Gerrit ter Borch, Frans van Mieris, Wilhelm van Elst. I just learned that he's working on a show on Oeterweil, as well as other broader themes, and indeed on the entire period of Dutch and Flemish Baroque art. All of these achievements have been widely recognized. For example, he was appointed Knight Officer in the Order of the Orange Nassau by the Dutch government in 1992, and Commander in the Order of Leopold I by the Belgian government in 2006. I'm happy to say that tonight's lecture will be filmed and is available as we speak for those of you who couldn't enter the room tonight, and in the future on our website. Please welcome Arthur Wheelock.
Thank you very much, Ian, and I am so happy to be here, back on this, actually this podium where I think I first spoke here in 1971, or something like that. It was a long time ago. Anyhow, it's a very special room, and it's a very special museum, and a very special occasion to be here with this wonderful group of paintings from the Mauritshuis, and particularly this lady that we are all here to celebrate. I don't normally write lectures out and read them, and I apologize, but tonight somehow I felt like it was appropriate to do so, because most of you are here because you've heard of this artist, and most of you are here because you know this painting already. So I figured if I'm going to talk about something about it, I've got to figure out something I've got to figure out about it. So anyhow, so I worked hard to try to figure out something. But anyhow, I still want to start with a couple of disclaimers, and that is the first is that I'd rather not be at this podium at all. I'd rather be looking at the girl on my own and standing in front of it, and that's partly because you don't need me. It's a painting that you can respond to very directly on your own. And there's little I can do to really enhance that experience. I mean, this one painting that really, in some ways, doesn't need any explanation beyond just the joy of being in front of it. And of course, this is an issue for all Vermeer paintings, this one in particular, but certainly it's something we can respond in all of his paintings, that they are meant to be seen quietly and personally, perhaps with a friend or a loved one. But to capture the fullness of that experience in a large lecture hall is pretty tough. So for the most part, I think what you can expect tonight is a little background information to help you frame your own personal relationships with this painting. And the second disclaimer is that I now realize that my title is fundamentally flawed. And that's not a great thing to figure out while you're preparing a lecture, but that's the reality. It turns out the girl with the pearl earring was far more of an icon throughout the course of the 20th century than I had realized. As a consequence, I have tried to focus this evening on varied ways that this painting has affected art lovers since it first appeared at a sale in The Hague in 1881, at which time was purchased for about 2 guilders, a pittance then as well as now. Seeing how earlier viewers responded to this work is quite revealing and can help us guide in our own understanding of Vermeer's artistic genius. That said, I would like to explain why I thought the title was a good one when I was first asked to provide it last spring. And the question of how this painting had become such an icon came to me after I had seen the catalog, and I realized that the exhibition title here is different than the catalog, but the catalog is what I saw, what I was sent, reminded me of an earlier traveling exhibition from the Moritz House when the girl with the pearl earring, which was then called Head of a Girl, came to America for the first time. And that was a show in 1982 that was opened by Queen Beatrix at the National Gallery, which celebrated the 200th anniversary of Dutch-American relations, which is the longest running relationship we have with another country. So it was very special. Much as today, that show was possible organized because the Moritz House was being renovated. Strikingly, while the face of the girl graces both catalog covers, the titles of these publications are quite different. In 1982, the exhibition was called Dutch Painting of the Golden Age from the Royal Picture Gallery, Moritz House. And now, as Ian just mentioned, Girl with the Pearl Earring, big and bold, and if you look really hard, you can see Dutch paintings from the Moritz House. Woo, that's very small. So anyhow, the painting has now taken pride of place, and by dint of text, color, and scale, the Moritz House, as well as the other Dutch paintings in the show, have taken a very back seat. Even more striking, the name of the artist who painted the girl is entirely absent. Vermeer? Who's he? The painting's become larger than the museum, and its maker has been entirely omitted. Fascinating. So what happened between 1982 and 2013 that helped elevate this painting to such an iconic level? One important moment in that trajectory was, of course, the Vermeer Exhibition at the National Gallery in the Moritz House in 1995-1996. Witnessing the extraordinary response to that event was an unforgettable experience. Vermeer lovers, both new and old, stood quietly and reverentially before his luminous works, sometimes spending 3 to 4 hours in the exhibition viewing the 21 masterpieces assembled from around the world. Day after day, young and old who had traveled long distances from Maine to California and even from the Netherlands lined up patiently in hopes of procuring an entrance ticket, enduring below freezing weather, snowstorms, and rain. Those standing in line, which often wrapped entirely around the National Gallery, I don't know if you can make this out, but there they are, going down the street, and way back here on the other side, there. In fact, at the end of the show, because I did a Charlie Rose show, that was an all-night thing, I know for a fact, that the show ended up, we had an ability to keep the show up until 9 p.m., and the first people in line at the end of the show were there at 9:30 p.m. for the next morning. So those standing in line, so they brought tents, mattresses, chairs, chess games, lots of hot coffee as they waited patiently, sometimes up to 12 hours before the exhibition would open in the morning. So I have often wondered why this exhibition evoked such an emotional chord, one unique in the history of American museums. Vermeer was at that time certainly revered, but I had assumed that his works would appeal to a rather narrow segment of the population. We had anticipated large crowds, but not the enormity of the public response. To some degree, I credit this painting, which was there for the first time given the title Girl with a Pearl Earring, for the high-level expectation that greeted the show. The painting had been especially restored for the exhibition, and it had gained enormous luminosity in its appearance. The Smithsonian Magazine, in its wisdom, placed its image on the cover of an issue featuring the exhibition, an issue that arrived at newsstands just prior to the opening. And even though the painting was not even mentioned in the article inside, the visual appeal of the cover was so great that the issue was read by more than 8.5 million people, and that's what the advertisement on the right, the Smithsonian advertisement, the best-selling issue in the magazine's history. The girl's visual appeal also persuaded the National Gallery, like the Frick today, I should say, to feature it on one of outdoor signs, and it quickly became the face of the show. The story of the Vermeer Exhibition has, of course, become part of museum lore. The exhibition was a victim of 2 government shutdowns and a blizzard that virtually closed Washington for a few days in January. And as a result, the exhibition became front-page news across the country. Nearly every magazine, as well as television and radio, ran stories about the exhibition's status, often featuring the girl in their coverage. A number of influential editorials decried the exhibition's closing, arguing that even during a federal government shutdown, the Vermeer Exhibition, a once-in-a-lifetime experience, should be kept open. The exhibition was exhilarating and exhausting for all of us at the gallery, both for the crowds, they're in there for 3 or 4 hours in that show, and for the extra demands that the political controversies had on our staff. As a thank you for everyone's yeoman efforts, the gallery arranged a staff party after the closing, at which time we all received this pin as a memento of this unforgettable experience. And I'm sure the girl felt very much the same sense of relief. The outpouring of public enthusiasm during the Vermeer Exhibition is particularly remarkable when one considers that it was not until the writings of the French critic Tory Bourget in the late 1860s that Vermeer's name was known beyond a small group of collectors and amateurs. The artist's fame spread quickly, so much so that by 1892, when Tory Bourget's own collection was auctioned in Paris, the sales catalog for this painting, the Concert, which Isabella Stewart Gardner then acquired, describes how Vermeer's rare works were, quote, considered as classics and worthy of ornamenting the finest cabinets of paintings. So how does one reconcile that glowing assessment with the fact that only 11 years previously, in 1881, the girl with the pearl earring had sold for only 2 guilders? And then what has happened since the time of Tory Bourget to elevate Vermeer today to such a cultural phenomenon? Vermeer's life story would hardly seem to have encouraged this response. Unlike a Rembrandt or a Gauguin, this Dutch 17th century painter from a small provincial city did not call attention to himself through outrageous behavior. On the contrary, the few documents that exist indicate that he led a responsible life, caring for his family while working as a painter and art dealer. The fact that he died penniless in 1676 seems to have been less his own fault than due to the collapse of the art market after the invasion of the Netherlands in 1672 by troops of Louis XIV. Finally, his quiet, intimate scenes of domestic life are unremarkable in subject matter, hardly the type of image that would seem to have excited a late 20th century, early 21st century society that all too often craves the new, the exotic, and the unusual. So why did people stand in line in snow and ice for hours outside the National Gallery to see this small group of masterpieces? To judge from the sentiments expressed, and I'm not exaggerating, the hundreds of letters and poems sent to me at the gallery at the time of that show, Most viewers came to the exhibition because of the special human qualities that pervade these works. One letter expressed a common thread among those who wrote. I, too, was first attracted to Vermeer's work because of his perfect composition and the harmony of his colors. But as I grew older and matured, I began to sense that his work could help me understand my life experiences. A poem about the girl with the pearl earring focused on the young woman's enigmatic gaze and the question that raises about how well we can fathom another person's thoughts. See how she turns to greet what comes, surprised but untroubled, not quite welcoming. She looks askance at one who has, unmasking, disturbed her solitude. Her greeting concedes what it must, but she remains turned to purposes of her own. The mystery of this young girl, who was open and welcoming, yet simultaneously reserved and unknowable, is one of the fascinations of this masterpiece, and, not surprisingly, has engaged the attention of viewers from the very moments that it arrived in the Lawrence House collection in 1902. Among the first foreign visitors to respond to this newly discovered Vermeer was the English novelist and poet Evie Lucas, whose book, A Wanderer in Holland, was published in 1905. The painting he wrote is one of the most beautiful things in Holland. It is, however, in no sense Dutch. The girl is not Dutch. The painting is Dutch only because it is the work of a Dutchman. No other Dutch painter could compass such liquid clarity, such cool surfaces. Indeed, none of the others seemed to have tried. A different ideal was theirs. Apart, however, from the question of technique, the picture has, to me, human interest beyond description. There is a winning charm to this simple Eastern face that no words of mine can express. All that is hard in the Dutch nature dissolves beneath her reluctant smile. She symbolizes the fairest and sweetest things in the 11 provinces. She makes Holland sacred ground. This account, written by a travel writer rather than an art critic or collector, suggests how directly the girl spoke to this early 20th century generation of art lovers. It fascinated viewers because of Vermeer's luminous painting technique and because it could not be precisely defined and described. It was Dutch, but not quite Dutch. It was exotically Eastern and had a human interest that was beyond description. Lucas poignantly recognized that Vermeer's genius lay in his ability to fuse the specifics of Dutch realism with the universal and the spiritual. With such an enthusiastic response already coming its way, how is it that the girl with the pearl earring had sold for only 2 guilders in 1881? Go back to that question. It turns out that the exceedingly low price was a bit of luck and old-fashioned collusion. Vermeer's paintings had by then, in fact, already achieved great renown thanks to Tory Berger, and they were avidly collected both in the Netherlands and abroad. The full scope of Vermeer's oeuvre, however, was still being defined, and collectors were searching hard for undiscovered works. As luck would have it, in this instance, only 2 individuals recognized that the girl, in poor condition and unattributed, was by Vermeer. One of them, on the left here, was the powerful Victor de Stoors, influential head of the Department of Arts and Sciences in the Netherlands, who was intent on preserving the country's artistic heritage. The other was a wealthy collector from The Hague, A.A. de Tom. Apparently, the 2 men secretly agreed that they would not bid against each other, with the understanding that de Tom would eventually bequeath the painting to the state. Indeed, he did so, and it entered the Lawrence House's collection at his death in 1902. An X-radiograph, and you have an image outside of the painting during restoration, but anyhow, the X-radiograph, which shows you the sort of buildup of the paint, for those of you who don't know much about, but you can see this gray area, that shows lead white, and these black areas are losses in the paint. So the X-radiograph shows you that the painting actually has numerous losses, paint losses, all throughout, and throughout the face in particular. So we can imagine, we don't know what it looked like then, but we can imagine that its appearance had been seriously compromised by its condition. After acquiring the painting, de Thom immediately sent it to a restorer in Antwerp, who seems to have successfully unified the modeling of the face. The discovery of Vermeer's monogram greatly enhanced the painting's value, and at the time of his bequest, it was valued at 40,000 guilders. So that went from 2 guilders to 40,000 in a matter of just a few years. A few years later, this monetary assessment was more poetically expressed by the Dutch art historian Jan Vet, who wrote that, quote, "More than any other Vermeer, one could say that looks as if it were blended from the dust of crushed pearls." The excitement generated by the arrival of new Vermeer in The Hague in 1902 was shared by collectors on both sides of the Atlantic, including, as mentioned, Isabella Stewart Gardner, who greatly prized her Vermeer, The Concert. Like de Thom and de Stoors, many of these collectors felt a social obligation to share their treasures with a broader public. Mrs. Gardner began building her museum at Fenway Court in 1900, while other American collectors and wealthy individuals supported the country's fledgling symphonies, libraries, and museums, among them the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Remarkably, in 1888, 1 year after he acquired Young Woman with a Water Pitcher, Henry Marquand donated to the Met the first Vermeer to enter an American public institution. The public debut of the collecting of Dutch art in America occurred at the Hudson Fulton celebration, an exhibition of 150 paintings held at the Met in 1909. Willem Valentiner, a great authority on Dutch art, organized the exhibition. He wrote in the catalog that the range and quality of the paintings in that exhibition would astonish European art circles, particularly the 37 paintings by Rembrandt, the 20 paintings by Frans Hals, and, remarkably, he says, 6 paintings by Vermeer, including Young Woman of Water Pitcher, A Woman Writing, which was then owned by J.P. Morgan, and Girl Interrupted at Her Music, here at the Frick, which was owned at that point by Henry Clay Frick. Valentiner was right. The exhibition did astonish, and it brought Vermeer to the awareness of a broader American public. One reporter raved, "The rare and incomparable artist Vermeer might be called the revelation and the bright particular star of this grand collection." For him, The Young Woman with a Water Pitcher was, quote, "one of the immortal productions of the art of Holland, a gem of purest ray serene." Throughout the course of the 20th century, art lovers have struggled to articulate the balance Vermeer was able to establish in his paintings between abstraction and reality, and between psychological perception and emotional reserve. The difficulty of maintaining this delicate balance is already evident in Valentiner's assessment of Vermeer's superiority over other Dutch genre painters. Superiority is the term he used. Echoing Evie Lucas's observation about the girl, Valentiner argued that Vermeer was unique, quote, in his rejection of all detail, in which his contemporaries had delighted. Valentiner asserted that Vermeer's power is concentrated in obtaining a perfection of surface, as well as in the wonderful play of light, the way he blended the few colors he employed into a, quote, perfect harmony. Importantly, Valentiner emphasized the aesthetic qualities of Vermeer's paintings rather than their mysterious character. For him, Vermeer's paintings have a, quote, purely aesthetic modern spirit, which he felt was intimately bound together with the emotional detachment of Vermeer's figures, who seem to exist in a realm apart from joy or sorrow. In 1913, shortly after the Hudson Fulton exhibition, Philip Leslie Hale, a Boston painter who had carefully studied Vermeer's The Concert at Fenway Court, published the first American monograph on the Dutch master, a 389-page tome about the man he considered, quote, the greatest painter who has ever lived. Hale wrote that for him, as well as for other Boston painters, quote, to paint like nature is to paint like Vermeer, and in this sense, we artists are his followers. Like Valentiner, Hale was struck by Vermeer's modernity, but as a painter himself, he went even further than had Valentiner in celebrating the aesthetic over the human qualities in Vermeer's works. No other master, Hale explained, had ever attempted to arrive at, quote here, to arrive at tone by an exquisitely just exquisitely just relation of color values. An idea, he continued, that lies at the root of all really good modern painting. Significantly, Hale asserted, if ever a man believed in art for art's sake, it was he. Vermeer anticipated the modern idea of impersonality in art. He makes no comment on the picture. One does not see by his composition what he thought of it at all. Portrait of a Young Girl, as Hale called it, epitomized Vermeer's modernity. There is no other head that one can think of that is rendered more purely or simply by just light and shade than this. No painter ever made anything more by simple light and shade than are the eye, nose, and mouth of this head. Simply, the mouth is made light where it came light, and dark where it was dark, and there is no handling visible. One cannot in any way see how the color was floated on. The form is simply there, perfectly rendered, the means of its making quite concealed. And it's interesting that almost as an afterthought, the last sentence of his account says about the girl, viewers, please note in parting the marvelously painted ear pendant. In the early 20th century, much of the appeal of Vermeer's paintings lay in their perceived modernity and their aesthetic qualities. One must remember that the judgments of Valentiner and Hale were being expressed just when Piet Mondrian was beginning to paint his abstract images of nature. For these writers, Vermeer's paintings were like treasured jewels, radiant and harmonious in their parts, yet emotionally cool and removed. This approach came to dominate Vermeer Studies for the next 50 years, not only because his painting had little anecdotal detail or obvious narrative content, but also because Vermeer's life story remained shrouded in mystery. Unlike assessments of Rembrandt's works, analyses of Vermeer's paintings were often separated from biographical considerations. It was frequently noted that when Vermeer came to paint his self-portrait in The Art of Painting, he turned away from the viewer. After World War II, a new strain of scholarship entered into Vermeer Studies, an interest in the apparent accuracy of his images. This was really stressed by the Dutch art historian P.T.A. Swillens, who was fascinated with Vermeer's use of perspective and was convinced that the artist carefully and precisely depicted the world about him. In his 1941 monograph, Swillens famously devised perspective constructions to calculate the exact shape and size of the artist's studios and the rooms he depicted. Constructions that have spawned many subsequent theories about Vermeer's uses of lenses and cameras obscures. It's interesting, Swillens' conviction that Vermeer only painted reality also spilled over into the realm of biography, particularly in regard to the girl with the pearl earring. In his discussion of The Girl's Head, which was his title, Swillens wrote at length about the girl's possible identity, speculating that she might have been one of Vermeer's daughters. Finally, he had to reject his thesis since, as he rightly concluded, none of the daughters would have been the right age for the model when Vermeer painted this work in the mid-1660s. But whomever the model, Swillens fully believed that the artist had not attempted to beautify his term or improve on her appearance. Every element of the image for him was accurate and explainable. including her expression. He wrote that the girl's eyes, quote, follow the painter's work, and perhaps the half-open mouth is the result of her interest. She is thinking of nothing else than being painted. Rather than being mysterious or Eastern, Swillens asserted that her blue-yellow head covering was a special children's dress, which helped explain the painting's, quote, simplicity and naivete. Little did he know that the author Tracy Chevalier, who was not as concerned about reality as was Swillens, would later come up with a perfect solution, but more on that development later. I mentioned Swillens at length because of his influence on Vermeer scholarship when I was a student in the 1960s and 1970s. His factual and descriptive approach and his emphasis on artists' realistic portrayal of the world about him overrode the earlier assessments of Valentina and Hale, which emphasized Vermeer's modernity, and in particular the aesthetic and emotional restrained character of his paintings. In retrospect, it is striking that both approaches overlook one of the most compelling aspects of Vermeer's work for contemporary viewers, the mystery and emotional intensity of his paintings, something that Evie Lucas and other early observers of the girl with the pearl earring had found so compelling. So what does this overview of earlier 20th century approaches to Vermeer's work tell us about his paintings, and how does it help us with our own encounters with Girl with the Pearl Earring? One conclusion that is easily reached is that the luster of the painting has not dimmed since it was discovered in 1881, but that each generation has found it compelling in very different ways. That quality, I feel strongly, is testament to the timeless character of this image, something that Vermeer instilled in so many of his paintings, even as with the girl in blue reading a letter, they seem drawn from everyday reality. The timelessness of Vermeer's images also helps explain, I think, why people stood so long in line to view Vermeer's paintings in the 1995-96 exhibition. Although they carefully admired his carefully conceived, aesthetically created works, the apparent realism of them, they were primarily there because these paintings satisfied some fundamental need. The letters and poems written by these visitors frequently focused on the inner peace and serenity that they felt before one of Vermeer's paintings. The subtle, understated dramas of his images, whether the nature of the text being read by this lady in blue, or that being written by the young woman writing the letter here, were captivating and compelling. One visitor wrote of the girl with the red hat, "The unexpected contact of her gaze startles. Time dissolves, and we are part of her world." Vermeer is a far different figure today than he would have been for art lovers in the early 20th century. More accessible, yet more complex. Stories such as his conversion to Catholicism because of his love for a young woman are now known, and belie the idea that he was unemotional and detached. The early 20th century art lover, moreover, had yet to witness the dramatic issues of theft and forgery that have followed the artist's rise in popularity, stories that highlight the emotional, monetary, and political value with which his paintings have been invested. Indeed, all of these components enter into our appreciation of his paintings today. Contemporary viewers also have a comfort level with Vermeer's paintings that stems in part from familiarity. Vermeer's paintings are so distinctive that once seen, they are never forgotten, and that is true of his works as varied as The Girl with the Red Hat, The View of Delft, and The Girl with a Pearl Earring. With knowing one, there is this powerful urge to see another and yet another, for one can never tire of the beauty of his light and color or the sense of peace that his works bring. As there are only about 36 known paintings, it is easy to build a repertoire of these images in one's mind, and even to imagine undertaking the sort of pilgrimage first traveled by Tory Burget in the 1860s to see them all. It was partly to fulfill that pilgrimage that many braved the Washington ice and snow to see the exhibition. I'm sure that has also been part of the reasons this exhibition here has been so incredibly popular. Finally, the enormous appeal of Vermeer's paintings is partly due to the fact that they reproduced remarkably well. While reproductions cannot capture the impact of scale and texture, they can effectively convey the clarity of his compositions, the purity of his light, and his distinctive yellows and blues. None reproduce better than this painting. This familiarity has also been enhanced throughout the 20th century by museum visitation, travel abroad, art history courses, and the publication of monographic studies, beginning with those by Philip Leslie Hale and P.T.A. Swillens. More recently, the visual power of the artist's paintings have been appropriated by book cover designers, and images of his paintings now also grace novels and books of poetry. By the late 1980s, filmmakers also began to appropriate Vermeer's images, as evident in this still from the 1983 movie Witness. It is in the realm of the novel, however, that Vermeer and his work have had their broadest impact in popular culture. For an artist who shunned narrative scenes and whose life story lacked drama, Vermeer would seem to offer few possibilities for fiction. Nevertheless, the mysteries surrounding his artistic career and the dramatic changes in the appreciation of his paintings have proven to be fertile ground for writers. J.P. Smith's The Discovery of Light, 1992, uses the woman holding a balance as a point of departure for a story about the ambiguities of life and the difficulty of truly understanding the thoughts of a beloved. The story travels back and forth between an imaginative account of Vermeer's life in Delft, particularly his relationship with his wife, Catharina Bons, and the narrator's own conflicts with his loved ones. The novel that has done the most to elevate The Girl with the Pearl Earring to iconic status is, of course, Tracy Chevalier's book of the same title, published in 2000. After visiting the Vermeer Exhibition when it was in The Hague, she became entranced by this painting. She constructed a moving story about its genesis and created a scenario where the artist's relationship to his family and models come alive, and where the enigmatic image of this young girl derived from human needs and concerns. The novel's popular success and its subsequent movie adaptation, in which Scarlett Johansson portrays Vermeer's model Griet, firmly placed this painting within the realm of popular culture. Partly, I suspect, because it seemed to answer, at least on a fictional basis, one of the mysteries surrounding this work, like who is this woman? So what can I now add to this discussion other than say that I do not believe that Griet was Vermeer's model, to try to explain why Girl with the Pearl Earring has such an allure for each succeeding generation? I would like to start by returning to Evie Lucas's fascinating observation that the painting is in no sense Dutch. I am sure that he wrote these words because at that time, in the early 20th century, partly through the writings of Tory Burget, the excitement of Dutch art was precisely that it accurately recorded every aspect of 17th century life, warts and all. This painting was somehow very different. However real the girl seemed in her winning charm, he wrote that all that is hard in Dutch nature dissolves beneath her reluctant smile. She makes Holland sacred ground. Indeed, Lucas was right. Set against a dark, undefined background and dressed in an exotic costume, this striking young woman cannot be placed in any specific context, certainly not Dutch. She seems to exist in a different realm, somewhat beyond the constraints of time and place. She does not even hold an attribute that might, for example, identify her as an allegorical figure, perhaps a muse or a sibyl. Almost certainly, this very absence of historic or iconographic framework helps this image be so accessible to all of us viewing her over the years. Her half-open mouth and liquid eyes impart immediacy to her presence, yet her purity and her evocative costume give her a lasting quality that remains forever embedded in our consciousness. Dating this remarkable image has proved difficult, not only because the costume has no parallel in contemporary Dutch fashions, but also because the absence of a spatial environment differs from Vermeer's interiors genre scenes of the late 1650s and 1660s, as in Woman with Balance. Nevertheless, the way the artist created his softly diffused flesh tones by layering a thin, flesh-colored glaze over an opaque layer is characteristic of his painting techniques from the mid-1660s. And that technique, you probably cannot make it out from the slide, but that is, believe me, is how the face of the girl and the woman in the Woman of Balance is painted. Also similar is the way he captured the effect of light falling across her face and turban. 2 small white dots on either side of the girl's mouth, echoing the highlights in her eyes, enliven her half-smile. Subtle shadows modulate her left cheek, and reflected light from her white collar animates her pearl earring, if it's pearl. We're not going to get into that one. Finally, as Vermeer often did in the mid-1660s, he painted the shaded portion of the girl's blue turban by freely applying broad glazes of natural ultramarine over a dark underpaint, thereby creating a deep resonance to those dark blues. To understand the quiet, mysterious character of this image, however, one needs to turn briefly to the artist's early career. His foundation as a history painter in the mid-1650s profoundly affected both the stylistic character and the thematic focus of his subsequent works. Although these paintings, among them Christ in the House of Mary and Martha on the left and Diana and her companions on the right, are hard to reconcile with the artist's later works, they show that he possessed a broadness of vision and of execution unlike any other genre painter of the period. Whereas, for example, the Leiden artist, Frans van Meers, painted in a refined manner on a small scale, and this is misleading because it's a small little copper about so big. Vermeer's training as a painter of large biblical mythological scenes meant that he was primarily concerned with the overall impact of his image and less with recording carefully individual textures and materials, such as did Van Meers. And this is a detail of the Vermeers painting where you see how he rendered in beautiful colors, but how carefully the materials and fabrics are rendered, and that broad application of glaze on the Vermeer turban where you have these broad, very broad strokes. That is entirely different in the mentality of how one creates the semblance of material in a painting. And those artistic origins, thus painting large paintings, mythological scenes, biblical scenes, help free him from the focus on detail that characterizes the genre paintings of so many of his contemporaries. When Vermeer turned his attention to genre scenes and cityscapes in the late 1650s, his painting techniques became more refined as he sought to emulate the appearance of reality. But they always maintained the capacity to suggest rather than to describe form and texture, as here in the wonderful painting in the Frick, the Officer and Laughing Girl. This he sought to do by capturing the effects of light in the world about him. In the Frick painting, for example, brilliant sunlight passing through the open window and the translucent planes of glass creates shimmering specular highlights on the yellow stripes of the woman's sleeves. On the other hand, Vermeer's softly modulated strokes on the map of Holland suggest the patina of age, for in the late 1650s, when Vermeer painted this work, the map was almost 40 years old. Thematically, Vermeer's history paintings depict quiet, brooding moments that emphasize the meditative side of life. This concern is implicit in Diana and her companions, where one of the maidens, with almost sacramental gravity, tenderly touches the foot of the goddess in a manner not unlike representations of Mary Magdalene cleansing the foot of Christ. These concerns underlie the distinctive character of Vermeer's apparently quotidian scenes of the 1660s, which have a seriousness of purpose that has virtually no parallel in Dutch painting at the time. This quality is particularly evident in Vermeer's paintings that focus on a woman in the midst of her daily activities. In such quiet moments of contemplation, when one gazes outward but looks inward, Vermeer discovered a window into that individual's spiritual nature. Here, a woman stands transfixed near the corner of her room as she, gazing into a mirror, holds the ribbons of her pearl necklace tautly in her hands. The scene is a familiar one, yet it transcends the common occurrences of daily life. All movement has stopped, as though the young woman has just seen herself in the mirror for the first time. The gesture, the mirror, the pearls together form a positive sense of wholeness, truthfulness, and purity. While the girl with the pearl earrings shares a fundamental relationship with Vermeer's other paintings, it is nevertheless different in many respects. As mentioned, the girl's head is situated against a dark background. It is larger and closer to the picture plane than in any of his genre scenes. While Vermeer may have arrived at this compositional solution on his own, stylistic connections with the painting of Michael Sweerts are so striking that possibility of contact between these two artists should be raised. Although Sweerts was a native of Brussels and had lived for a number of years in Rome, where he had been associated with the Accademia di San Luca, he lived in Amsterdam in the early 1660s. Vermeer had contacts in Amsterdam, and the two artists could have met at that time. And this painting, as many of you know, is in Hartford in the Athenaeum. And this is one of many of these types of heads that he painted. So Sweerts was also Catholic, a very devout Catholic, and shared with Vermeer the ideal of investing scenes of daily life with classical dignity, an ideal that has its origins in Italian traditions even more so than in Dutch. Much as with the girl with the pearl earrings, Sweerts' busts of youths with similar pure profiles set against dark, undefined backgrounds also stare out of the picture plane with wet, lucid eyes, and at least one wears an exotic turban. No document links these two artists, but their shared interest in creating a timeless sense of beauty and harmony in their works is compelling. Girl with a Pearl Earring is, in many respects, the purest expression of Vermeer's classicism, a stylistic characteristic that unifies his entire oeuvre, from his early biblical and mythological paintings to his late genre scenes. The balance, harmony, and timelessness that epitomize his work is here distilled to its very essence, where every stroke, however freely rendered, and every contour, however natural its forms, is placed with an intuitive sense of purpose and place. Indeed, the process by which Vermeer achieved these effects can never be fully explained, for his classicism is uniquely his own, seemingly created without careful mathematical or geometrical underpinnings. Vermeer's classicism, however, is not just compositional, it is thematic as well. His images inevitably explore realms of physical beauty, moments of moral choice, and expressions of spiritual belief that probe to the very essence of the human experience. Here, in an image that is both physically beautiful and spiritually pure, Vermeer has captured an ideal that fully bridges the realm between the public and the private, where the individual stands for ideals that are enduring and shared by all humanity. Thank you very much.